The moment my father cleared his throat, the room obeyed him the way it always had, falling into a respectful silence that felt less like courtesy and more like conditioning. We were seated around the long dining table in his house, the same house where we had grown up learning which chairs were safe to sit in and which moods to avoid. The windows were open, letting in the late afternoon breeze, but the air inside felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. My father stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the polished wood as if it were a podium instead of a dining surface. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. His expression was composed, almost ceremonial, the kind he used when he wanted to remind us who he was and who we were supposed to be in relation to him. None of us knew yet that the next sentence he spoke would permanently fracture what little illusion of family we had left. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy," he began, his voice calm and deliberate, every word measured for maximum effect. "About what I've built, what I've sacrificed, and who deserves to carry my name forward." I felt my shoulders tense instinctively, a familiar warning bell going off in my chest. My siblings sat straighter, exchanging quick glances, already calculating what this conversation might mean for them. I stayed still, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on the grain of the table. I had learned long ago that looking directly at him during moments like this only invited unnecessary attention. Still, something about his tone felt sharper than usual, edged with a quiet satisfaction that made my stomach tighten. He paused, letting the silence stretch, enjoying the anticipation he had cultivated so expertly over the years. "When the time comes," he continued, "my estate will go to my real children." The word real landed with a dull, brutal finality, like a gavel striking wood. For a heartbeat, I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. My ears rang, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath us had shifted. I looked up then, unable to stop myself, my eyes flicking to his face, searching for some sign of hesitation, some hint that this was a poorly phrased joke or an incomplete thought. There was none. His gaze swept the table with quiet authority, never lingering on me. No one spoke. Not immediately. My brother inhaled sharply, then seemed to think better of reacting. My sister's lips parted, then closed again, her face carefully neutral. I felt a strange calm wash over me, the kind that arrives when something you've feared for years finally happens. There it was, spoken aloud, stripped of ambiguity. I was not a real child in his eyes. Not enough to count. Not enough to inherit. Not enough to be named without qualification. The realization didn't hurt the way I'd imagined it would. Instead, it felt cold, clarifying, like finally seeing the shape of a shadow that had followed me my entire life. He went on speaking, elaborating on values, responsibility, bloodlines, using language that sounded noble if you didn't listen too closely. I only caught fragments, my attention drifting inward as memories surfaced uninvited. The way he'd always introduced me differently than the others. The comments about gratitude, about knowing my place. The reminders that I was lucky to be included at all. All those moments rearranged themselves now, forming a pattern too clear to ignore. This announcement wasn't impulsive. It was the culmination of years of quiet distinction, of lines drawn just subtly enough that only I ever seemed to feel them. Then he said it again, more explicitly, as if to ensure there would be no misunderstanding. "The will reflects this decision," he stated. "My estate lawyer has all the necessary documents prepared." That sentence snapped something in the room. My sister shifted uncomfortably. My brother frowned, confusion briefly crossing his face before being replaced by something more calculating. I felt eyes flick toward me and then quickly away, like no one wanted to be caught acknowledging my presence in the wake of that declaration. I remained silent, my pulse steady, my breathing slow, because reacting would only give him what he wanted, proof that his words still had power over me. That was when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and unexpected. My father looked mildly irritated, as though the interruption offended him. "That will be the lawyer," he said, smoothing his jacket, his composure returning instantly. "We might as well address this properly." He gestured toward the entryway, already confident in the narrative he believed he controlled. As he moved to open the door, I noticed something small but significant. The slightest tightening around his mouth, the kind that appears when even the most certain people feel the faintest flicker of unease. The estate lawyer entered with a polite nod, a leather briefcase in hand, his demeanor professional and neutral. He greeted my father warmly, then acknowledged the rest of us with brief, courteous glances. When his eyes reached me, they lingered just a second longer than the others, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition. It caught me off guard. I straightened slightly, unsure why that look unsettled me more than my father's announcement had. The lawyer took a seat at the table and opened his briefcase, withdrawing a thick folder of documents. "Shall we begin?" my father asked, his voice confident again, already slipping into the role of patriarch and authority. The lawyer nodded, flipping through the papers with practiced ease. "Yes," he replied, then paused. His brow furrowed almost imperceptibly as he scanned the pages. He flipped back, then forward again, slower this time. The room seemed to hold its breath. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, utterly certain of the outcome. "I'm just going to clarify something before we proceed," the lawyer said carefully, looking up from the folder. His gaze moved from my father to the rest of us, then settled briefly on me before returning to my father. "The document you're referring to, about real children, is not the primary will I have on file." The words didn't register immediately. My father laughed softly, dismissively. "That's impossible," he said. "I reviewed it myself." The lawyer didn't smile. He reached back into the briefcase and pulled out a second folder, thinner but marked with official tabs and signatures. "This," he said evenly, placing it on the table, "is the most recent, legally binding document." For the first time since the conversation began, my father's confidence faltered. And in that moment, I understood something profound and terrifying all at once. Whatever my father believed he controlled was no longer entirely in his hands. The lawyer's fingers rested lightly on the thinner folder, as if he understood that its weight was far heavier than the paper suggested. The room had gone still again, but this time the silence felt different, charged, alert, as though every person present sensed that the balance of power had shifted without yet understanding how or why. My father's confident posture stiffened, his arms slowly uncrossing as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the folder like it was an intruder that didn't belong at his table. "That can't be right," he said again, his tone clipped, the faintest edge of irritation slipping through the practiced calm. "I was very clear about my intentions." The lawyer nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the way professionals do when they are about to contradict someone without raising their voice. "I understand you believe that," the lawyer replied evenly. "But my responsibility is not to belief or intention as spoken. It is to the most recent document that meets all legal requirements." He opened the folder carefully, aligning it square with the table, then turned it so my father could see the first page clearly. Even from my seat, I recognized the familiar layout of legal formatting, the bold header, the clean margins, the signature lines at the bottom. My father's gaze locked onto the page, and for a split second, something flickered across his face, confusion, perhaps, or the discomfort of seeing something he hadn't anticipated. He masked it quickly, but I saw it. I had spent a lifetime watching his expressions for early warnings. My siblings leaned forward instinctively, curiosity pulling them closer despite themselves. My sister's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, her composure slipping just enough to reveal unease beneath it. My brother frowned, his jaw working as though he were already recalculating outcomes, silently reordering the future he'd assumed was settled. I stayed where I was, my back straight, my hands still folded in my lap, feeling a strange, unfamiliar steadiness take hold. For the first time since my father spoke, I wasn't bracing myself for impact. I was watching something unfold, something that no longer required my defense or explanation. This version of the will, the lawyer continued, was executed 18 months ago, following a formal review and witnessed by 2 independent parties. It includes amendments that supersede any previous drafts. He slid the document a fraction closer to my father. As you can see, it bears your signature. My father's eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, and his lips pressed together so tightly the color drained from them. He didn't deny it outright this time. He couldn't. The signature was unmistakably his, sharp, deliberate, the same one he used on everything from business contracts to holiday cards. Seeing it there, attached to a document he clearly hadn't anticipated being read aloud today, rattled him in a way his earlier announcement never could. "I don't remember this," my father said finally, his voice lower now, edged with something like defensiveness rather than authority. "There must be some mistake." The lawyer shook his head gently, not unkindly. "There is no mistake," he said. "This document was discussed in detail at the time. Notes from that meeting are attached. You asked specific questions about language, beneficiaries, and contingencies." He paused, then added, "You were very precise." The emphasis on that last phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. Precision was my father's pride. To suggest he had signed something without understanding it was not only incorrect, it was an insult. My father leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose, his eyes lifting from the paper to scan the room. For a moment, his gaze passed over me without stopping, as if my presence were still irrelevant to the conversation he thought he controlled. But then the lawyer spoke again, and everything changed. "Before I proceed," he said, "I need to confirm that all named parties are present." He looked around the table, ticking names off silently. "Yes," he said at last, his eyes settling on me with deliberate clarity. "Everyone is here." The words sent a ripple through the room. My sister glanced at me, her expression unreadable. My brother shifted in his seat. My father's head turned sharply, finally landing on me with a look that was no longer dismissive, but assessing. "I don't see why this needs to include," my father began, but the lawyer raised a hand gently, interrupting without apology. "With respect," he said, "it includes everyone named in the will." The emphasis was unmistakable. "Named." My heart beat once, hard and slow, but my face remained calm. I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication. Only a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be undone by bluster or denial. The document existed. It had been signed. And it was about to be read. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. He read methodically, his tone neutral, his pacing unhurried, allowing each clause to settle before moving on. He started with formalities, identifications, acknowledgments, revocations of prior wills. My father listened with a rigid stillness, his fingers curled against the arm of his chair, knuckles pale. The words flowed on, steady and relentless, building toward something none of us could yet see clearly. My siblings exchanged brief glances, their earlier confidence giving way to uncertainty. Whatever they had expected to hear tonight, this was not it. When the lawyer reached the section on beneficiaries, the air seemed to tighten. "In the event of my death," he read, "I direct that my estate be distributed as follows." My father shifted again, his foot tapping once against the floor, a small, unconscious betrayal of nerves. The lawyer did not look up as he continued, naming assets, accounts, properties in careful detail. Some portions were familiar, things my father had always talked about openly. Others were not. I saw my sister's eyes widen slightly at the mention of holdings she hadn't known existed. My brother's brow furrowed deeper, his calculations visibly faltering as the scope of the estate expanded beyond his expectations. "And now," the lawyer said, turning a page, "the primary distribution." He paused, not for effect, but to ensure accuracy. "I leave the remainder of my estate to be divided as follows." My father straightened, clearly bracing himself for confirmation of his earlier declaration. The lawyer's voice remained even as he read the next line. "To my children, without distinction, as named herein." The phrase struck like a bell. Without distinction. My father's head snapped up. "That's not what I said," he interjected sharply. The lawyer met his gaze calmly. "What you said earlier," he replied, "is not what is written here." He continued reading, naming each of us in turn. When he reached my name, he did not hesitate, did not lower his voice or qualify it in any way. He spoke it clearly, firmly, as if it had always belonged there. I felt a subtle shift inside me, not relief, not joy, but recognition. The document didn't argue for my place. It assumed it. My siblings reacted differently. My sister inhaled sharply, her mouth tightening. My brother stared at the table, his earlier certainty evaporating into something like disbelief. My father sat very still, his expression unreadable, but the color had drained from his face. "That's impossible," my father said again, but the words lacked conviction now. "There must be another version." The lawyer closed the folder carefully. "There is no other version with legal standing," he said. "This is the document that will be enforced." He let the silence return, long and heavy, before adding, "If there are no further questions, I can outline the next steps." No one spoke. No one moved. The announcement my father had made earlier, so confident, so absolute, hung in the air, stripped of its power, exposed as nothing more than a declaration without authority. I sat there, absorbing the moment, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the room, but within me. For years, my place in this family had been treated as conditional, provisional, subject to someone else's definition of legitimacy. But the document didn't care about narratives or bloodlines as he framed them. It cared about what was written, signed, witnessed. And in that quiet, undeniable way, it told a different story, one my father could not erase with words. Whatever came next, arguments, accusations, attempts to regain control, I knew one thing with certainty. The future my father had just announced was not the future that would happen. For a long moment after the lawyer finished reading, no one spoke, as though the room itself were waiting to see who would dare to move first. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was crowded with unspoken reactions, each one pressing against the others. My father remained seated at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the chair arms as if they were the only solid things left in a world that had suddenly become unreliable. I watched his face carefully, not out of triumph, but out of habit. Years of living under his authority had trained me to read his expressions for signs of what was coming next. This time, what I saw unsettled me more than anger would have. It was disbelief, pure and unfiltered, mixed with a dawning awareness that something had slipped beyond his control. My sister was the first to break the silence, though she didn't speak right away. She shifted in her chair, the movement sharp and restless, and glanced from the lawyer to my father and then to me. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long, as if she were reassessing something she'd taken for granted her entire life. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured, like she was testing each word before letting it out. "Dad," she said, is this really the will?" The question sounded almost childlike, stripped of the confidence she'd carried earlier. My father didn't answer immediately. He stared at the closed folder on the table as if it had personally betrayed him. "I don't understand how this happened," he said finally, his voice tight, the authority drained from it. "I made my wishes clear." The lawyer didn't respond right away. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and looked at my father with professional calm. "Your wishes," he replied, "are reflected in the document you signed. This is not a matter of interpretation." It's a matter of record. The word record landed hard. It was final. Unchangeable. My father had built his entire life on being the final word, the one who defined truth simply by stating it. Now, his own signature had stripped him of that power. My brother leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his earlier confidence gone. I could almost hear the calculations running through his head, the quiet mental arithmetic of loss and adjustment. He didn't look at me directly, but I felt his awareness of me like a shift in air pressure. For years, I had existed on the margins of these conversations, included but never centered, tolerated but never prioritized. Now, without saying a word, the document had placed me firmly inside the circle he thought belonged only to him and our sister. The realization unsettled him, and I didn't blame him for that. Change always feels threatening when you benefit from the old order. My father finally looked up, his gaze landing on me with a sharpness that made my shoulders tense despite my resolve. "You knew about this," he said suddenly, his voice rising just enough to slice through the room. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, delivered with the certainty of someone who needed to believe betrayal came from outside himself. I met his eyes calmly, resisting the urge to defend myself the way I used to. "No," I said simply. "I didn't." The truth didn't need elaboration. I hadn't known. But I also hadn't been surprised, and I suspected that distinction infuriated him even more. "That's convenient," he snapped, his composure cracking at last. "You sit there quietly, pretending to be shocked, while this," he gestured toward the lawyer, the folder, the table, the room. "This happens." The lawyer cleared his throat softly, a reminder that this was not a private argument to be rewritten at will. "For clarity," he said, "no beneficiary is informed of the contents of a will prior to its execution unless the testator chooses to disclose it. In this case, there is no indication that anyone present was informed in advance." His words landed like a barrier, blocking my father's attempt to redirect blame. My sister's attention shifted fully to my father now, her expression tight with confusion and something dangerously close to doubt. "Dad," she said again, more firmly this time, "did you sign this?" The question hung in the air, unavoidable. My father opened his mouth, then closed it, then looked away. That hesitation spoke volumes. "Of course I signed something," he said at last, irritation flaring again. "I've signed countless documents over the years." The lawyer nodded once. "Yes," he said, "and this was one of them." He slid a page forward again, tapping the signature line gently. "Your signature is here, here, and here. The witnesses' signatures are also present. Everything is in order." Something in my father's face shifted then, the disbelief giving way to anger, and beneath it, fear. I realized in that moment that what unsettled him most was not the distribution of assets. It was the loss of narrative control. He had stood in that room minutes earlier and declared who was real and who was not, confident that his words would shape reality. Now, reality was pushing back, quietly but firmly, and he didn't know how to fight it. He had always believed that legitimacy was something he granted. The documents suggested otherwise. "I need some air," he muttered, pushing his chair back abruptly and standing. The movement was sudden, almost desperate. He paced toward the window, staring out into the yard without really seeing it. My sister watched him go, then turned toward me again, her eyes searching my face for something. An explanation, perhaps, or reassurance that I wasn't about to gloat. I gave her none. I simply met her gaze, steady and neutral, because this wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning. The lawyer gathered his papers calmly, his role nearly complete. "I'll follow up with each of you individually to discuss next steps," he said. "If there are any disputes, they can be addressed through the appropriate legal channels." The phrase legal channels seemed to irritate my father further, but he didn't turn around. He stood with his back to us, shoulders tense, as if staring long enough into the distance might restore the authority he'd lost. My brother stood as well, murmuring something about needing to think, and left the room without looking at me. That left me sitting at the table with my sister, the lawyer, and my father's rigid silhouette at the window. I felt an unexpected wave of exhaustion wash over me. Not physical tiredness, but the deep weariness that comes from decades of being quietly diminished. The document hadn't just changed the future, it had illuminated the past. Every slight, every distinction, every reminder that I was different suddenly had context. It wasn't just cruelty. It was insecurity. It was control. And now it was unraveling. When my father finally turned back around, his expression had hardened into something more familiar, cold, guarded, strategic. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to me before returning to the lawyer. The lawyer met his gaze evenly. "No," he agreed. "It's simply clarified." The difference mattered more than my father realized. Clarification leaves little room for rewriting history. It forces everyone to confront what was already true, whether they're ready or not. As the meeting dissolved and people began to leave, I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the room empty around me. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't afraid. I was absorbing the reality that, for the first time, my place in this family had been acknowledged without conditions. Not by my father's voice, but by ink and witness and law. And as I stood and walked past him toward the door, I understood something quietly, decisively. He could still deny me with words. But he could no longer erase me with them. The days that followed did not bring peace or closure, only a slow tightening of pressure that made it clear my father had no intention of accepting what had been read aloud in that dining room. Silence from him was never a sign of reflection or humility, it was preparation. I had learned that as a child, watching how he would retreat just long enough to decide his next move, only to return with a revised version of reality that favored him. True to form, his first attempt came disguised as concern. He called me late one evening, his voice softer than I remembered it being in years, asking how I was holding up after all the confusion. He spoke as though the document had materialized on its own, as though the lawyer had misinterpreted something obvious, as though the pain of that announcement hadn't been deliberate. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the pattern, waiting for the pivot I knew was coming. When it came, it was subtle but unmistakable. He suggested we meet privately, just the two of us, to clear the air. He said families shouldn't let outsiders, lawyers, paperwork, technicalities, drive wedges between them. The words were carefully chosen, meant to frame the legal truth as an intrusion rather than a correction. I agreed to meet him, not because I believed he wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to see the strategy clearly, without intermediaries or raised voices muddying the water. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground where he couldn't rely on the authority of familiar walls or heirloom furniture to reinforce his dominance. He arrived early and had already ordered when I walked in, another small assertion of control. He stood to greet me, his smile practiced, his eyes scanning my face as if checking for weakness. We exchanged pleasantries that felt stiff and performative, then sat across from each other, the small round table between us feeling far too intimate for the distance that had grown between us. For a moment, he spoke about nothing of consequence, the weather, a recent business deal, someone we both knew, laying the groundwork for what he clearly believed would be a productive conversation. I let him talk, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, my posture relaxed but attentive. Eventually, he leaned back and sighed, shaking his head slowly, as if weighed down by disappointment rather than exposed by his own actions. "I never meant for things to go the way they did," he said. "That announcement was taken out of context." I raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. He continued, explaining that he'd been emotional that day, that he'd misspoken, that the words real children hadn't been intended the way they sounded. He spoke with conviction, attempting to retrofit meaning into a statement that had been perfectly clear when he made it. It was impressive, in a way, how effortlessly he tried to rewrite the past. I wondered how often he'd done this successfully, how many people had doubted their own memories because of his certainty. Then he shifted, his tone becoming more pointed, more strategic. He suggested that the will could be amended again, that perhaps the lawyer had used outdated language, that a cleaner version might better reflect what he actually wanted. He said it would be easier for everyone if we resolved things quietly, without letting it become a spectacle. When I didn't respond immediately, he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You know," he said, "this doesn't have to be adversarial. We can make sure you're taken care of without complicating matters." The implication was clear. Inclusion could be negotiated. Legitimacy could be conditional again. I felt something settle inside me then, solid and immovable. For years, I had been taught to accept conditional acceptance, to be grateful for scraps of recognition, to believe that peace required my silence. Sitting across from him now, listening to him try to reclaim control by reframing generosity as leverage, I realized how far I'd already come. "I'm not interested in changing anything," I said calmly. "The document says what it says." He frowned, clearly unused to hearing defiance delivered without emotion. "You're being unreasonable," he replied. "This is family." I met his gaze steadily. "Family doesn't erase facts," I said. "And it doesn't get to decide when truth is inconvenient." His expression hardened, the mask slipping just enough to reveal frustration. He accused me of exploiting a technicality, of letting resentment cloud my judgment, of forgetting everything he'd done for me. The familiar litany rolled out, each line designed to trigger guilt and obligation. I listened, but the words no longer landed the way they once did. They floated past me, hollow and ineffective. When he finally paused, waiting for my reaction, I said something I'd never said to him before. "You signed it," I reminded him gently. "Whatever you intended, you made it binding." The statement wasn't accusatory. It was factual. And facts, I had learned, were the only language he couldn't argue his way out of. He left the cafe abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his coffee untouched. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle, aware of how different this confrontation felt from every other one we'd had. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't replaying the conversation to see where I'd gone wrong. I felt clear. Centered. When I finally stood and walked out into the late afternoon sun, I realized something important. The power dynamic had shifted not because the document existed, but because I no longer needed his approval to stand by it. In the weeks that followed, his tactics escalated. He spoke to my siblings, framing himself as the victim of manipulation, suggesting I had influenced the lawyer or taken advantage of his trust. Some of it worked. My brother grew distant, cautious in his communication, clearly unsure which version of the story to believe. My sister oscillated between sympathy and suspicion, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. I didn't chase them. I didn't defend myself beyond repeating the same simple truth: I hadn't written the document. I hadn't altered it. I had only existed within it. The consistency unsettled them more than any argument could have. Then came the formal notice from my father's new attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss potential amendments. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. There was a time when such a request would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety, fear of confrontation tightening my chest. This time, it didn't. I forwarded it to the estate lawyer and asked for guidance, trusting the process rather than personal negotiation. When the response came back, it was clear and firm: any amendment would require the same formalities as the original document, including capacity evaluations and witness verification. The hurdles were real. The process was slow. And for the first time, my father couldn't shortcut his way through with authority alone. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet stretching comfortably around me, I reflected on how strange it felt to be at the center of a conflict I hadn't created. I hadn't asked to be declared unreal. I hadn't demanded inclusion. I hadn't engineered the document. And yet, by simply refusing to retreat, I had forced a reckoning that rippled outward, exposing truths my family had avoided for years. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was accountability, arriving quietly and refusing to leave. I knew then that whatever my father tried next, whether charm, pressure, or legal maneuvering, it wouldn't restore the world as he wanted it to be. The announcement he'd made so confidently had failed, not because it lacked cruelty, but because it lacked authority. And in trying to take back what he believed was his to give or deny, he had revealed the one thing he feared most. He could no longer control the story. The letter from my father's new attorney arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath my door in a cream-colored envelope that looked intentionally understated, as if restraint itself were meant to signal reasonableness. I recognized the tactic immediately. Everything about my father's approach shifted once direct persuasion failed. When he couldn't dominate a narrative, he attempted to civilize it, sanding down the edges until his authority seemed merely procedural instead of personal. I didn't open the letter right away. I let it sit on my kitchen counter while I made coffee, the envelope occupying my peripheral vision like a quiet dare. There was a time when correspondence from his representatives would have triggered a cascade of dread, my mind racing through imagined outcomes before I'd even read a word. That morning, however, I felt only a measured curiosity, the kind that comes when you know a door has already closed and someone on the other side keeps knocking out of habit. When I finally read it, the language was predictably careful. It referenced family harmony, clarifying intentions, and exploring mutually agreeable solutions. It proposed a mediated meeting to discuss amendments to the will, framed as a collaborative effort rather than a reversal. The subtext was clear enough to feel almost insulting. If I would just be flexible, just be reasonable, just accept a revised version of inclusion, everything could go back to being manageable. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope, then forwarded a scanned copy to the estate lawyer with a brief note asking for his assessment. I didn't feel the need to add commentary. The facts spoke for themselves, and I had learned that the more I explained myself, the more room my father found to reinterpret me. The lawyer's response came later that afternoon, concise and unambiguous. Any amendment, he wrote, would require fresh execution under strict conditions, including independent evaluation of capacity and intent, given the recent dispute. He added that attempts to pressure beneficiaries outside of counsel could complicate matters further. Reading those words, I felt a subtle release of tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The system my father had relied on for decades, relationships, intimidation, selective generosity, did not translate cleanly into legal reality. Paperwork does not flinch. Procedures do not negotiate with tone. For the first time, I was not standing alone opposite him. I was standing alongside something impersonal, slow-moving, and resolute. That didn't stop him from trying other angles. He called my siblings, and through them, he tried to reach me indirectly. Messages came wrapped in concern, in warnings, in half-spoken threats about how drawn-out disputes never end well. My brother sent a text suggesting we talk before lawyers make this worse, as if the lawyers had created the conflict rather than documented it. My sister asked whether I would consider something fair, her definition of fair shifting noticeably from week to week. I replied to both with the same steady refrain: I wasn't contesting anything, and I wasn't negotiating. I was abiding by what already existed. The repetition seemed to frustrate them more than outright refusal would have. It left no foothold for argument. At the same time, something else began to happen, quieter but no less significant. Stories surfaced. An aunt called me one evening and confessed, in a voice thick with hesitation, that she'd always wondered why I was treated differently. A cousin admitted he'd heard my father refer to me as complicated in contexts that had nothing to do with me at all. These weren't revelations so much as confirmations, pieces of a long-held pattern finally spoken aloud because circumstances had made denial uncomfortable. I listened without judgment, not because I felt vindicated, but because I understood how loyalty can blind people until the cost of blindness becomes too high. The document hadn't just changed my standing. It had disrupted the permission structure that allowed others to look away. The mediated meeting my father requested never happened. His attorney withdrew the request after receiving the estate lawyer's response, citing scheduling conflicts and reassessment of strategy. The phrase made me smile despite myself. Strategy implies options. My father's options were narrowing, and he knew it. I imagined him pacing familiar rooms, replaying that dining room announcement in his head, searching for the moment where he might have regained control if only he'd said one thing differently. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But sympathy, I'd learned, does not require surrender. Weeks passed, and life resumed its quieter rhythms. I went to work, met friends, cooked dinners that didn't taste like tension. The conflict did not disappear, but it receded, like a storm moving offshore, its presence still felt but no longer dominating the horizon. One evening, I received a final message from my father, not through an attorney or a sibling, but directly. It was brief. He wrote that he hoped time would bring clarity and that he regretted how things were perceived. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the words he'd spoken or the harm they'd caused. He simply expressed discomfort with the consequences. I read the message once and did not reply. In the quiet that followed, I understood the true nature of what could not be undone. It wasn't the document. It wasn't the distribution of assets or the legal standing it granted me. It was the exposure. My father had revealed, publicly and unequivocally, how he measured worth. No amendment could erase that moment. No revised language could restore the illusion that had protected him from scrutiny. Even if he changed the will tomorrow, even if he found a way to reassert control on paper, the truth would remain visible to everyone who had been in that room. He had drawn a line, and the line had been seen. The strangest part was how little triumph I felt. There was no rush of victory, no sense of having won something back. What I felt instead was alignment. The person I had always been, the one who endured, adapted, learned to exist without guarantees, finally matched the reality in front of me. I no longer needed to contort myself to fit someone else's definition of legitimacy. The record reflected my existence without qualifiers, and that was enough. It didn't fix the past, but it stopped the past from dictating the future. As I turned off the lights that night, I thought again of the dining room, the announcement, the shock on my father's face when authority slipped through his fingers. Power, I realized, is not the ability to declare something true. It is the ability to withstand truth when it answers back. My father had built his life on declarations. I was building mine on what remained after them. And that, more than any inheritance, was the thing he could never take back. If you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories.